Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about a project that I've been working on for almost 10 years now. And the project really unifies my two research fields. The one is forecasting, that's really where I come from. So I'm doing research on how we can make better predictions. And the other one is automated news or automated journalism. And I actually wrote a Tao report about a guide to automated journalism, which you should look into, because that's not what I'm talking about, which is somewhat unexpected. Because when I got the invitation, I thought I would talk about the automation part, because the forecasting part is rather uninteresting, because it was so clear that Clinton would win. Now I think it's more interesting to talk about the forecasting aspect of the work and to really look into what actually went wrong. So, as many others, we also didn't get it right. We predicted, and when I say we, it's a project started in 2004, which is called the Polyvote, which I'm running with 3 colleagues in the United States. And the original goal of the project was to take research findings from forecasting research and apply them to election forecasting and to show how we can do forecasting. So we predicted Clinton to win the popular vote, which she did, and we got that right within the margin of error. But we also got the more important forecast pretty wrong. And we didn't put a probability estimate on that forecast, but we were pretty confident that she would win the Electoral College. Now, of course, we weren't alone. Pretty much everybody else who was doing Electoral College predictions got it wrong. To be fair, some were more conservative than others about Clinton's chances, but the consensus really was that she would win this. Even people in the Trump campaign didn't think that they have a chance at winning the election just the day before. So the question really is, what went wrong with the forecasts? Now, we heard that this morning as well, many people now blame the polls. But actually, when you look at the national polls, they were pretty good. The error of the national polls was actually smaller than it used to be in previous elections. In 2012, for example, we had a higher error in the national polls, but nobody paid attention because it didn't matter for the outcome of the election. The problem in this year was that we had large polling error and out of the margin of error in some critical key states, such as Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where the polls really had Clinton ahead pretty much the whole campaign by large margins. And this was really what decided the election. Now, there's right now a lot of research that is looking at what exactly went wrong with the polls there, and we don't know the answer yet. What we do know is that it's getting more and more difficult to do polls. It's harder and harder to reach people. It's harder and harder to get people to respond to polls. And if the response behavior is not random anymore, but systematic differential non-response, then you have a problem, because you have to make many assumptions about how your final electorate would look like. And it seems like what went wrong was that the pollsters underestimated Trump's support among non-college educated white voters, and on the other hand, overestimated Clinton's support among many other demographic groups. But it wasn't just the polls. And I think we can learn a lot about what went wrong in this election by looking also at forecasts from other methods. So as I said, this is really a research project in forecasting research. And if there is one thing that we know from 50 years of forecasting research, is that you shouldn't put too much trust in one single forecast. Instead, what we should do is you should combine forecasts from many different methods that use lots of different information. That has been shown in hundreds of studies in different fields. It's a really valuable way to create accurate predictions. Now, how can we predict elections? Most of you probably think, well, election forecasting, isn't that the polls? And also Martin this morning said, well, you know, he doesn't really trust the polls, but that's all we have. Well, actually, that's not really the case. There is many other methods, and many of which are older than polls and also tend to be more accurate than polls. So before the era of polls, people relied on other people's judgment of what's going to happen. And of course, one of the oldest methods to predict anything is to ask experts what they think is going to happen. And this is what we do as well in our project. So we reach out to political scientists across the country, and we periodically ask them about their forecast of the election. So in the middle here, you see the arrow on the left is always the arrow in previous elections. So the average arrow here, and the right is the arrow in 2016. And you can see that in 2016, the arrow is much larger than it was in previous elections for the expert forecasts. And why we ask experts is because experts know that polls have error. But what we do accept them or expect them to be able to is to kind of identify in which direction the error is. So you could expect experts to kind of say, well, polls have error, but we can adjust the forecast in the right direction. Well, the interesting thing is that the opposite happened in 2016. The experts actually thought that Clinton's vote share would be underestimated by the polls. Now, this might seem crazy now, but at that time there was lots of talk about early voting numbers that look good for Clinton, about Trump doesn't really have a ground game, and things like that that could really kind of create that narrative. But then on the other hand, there were also lots of information that, things could be the other way as well. There was lots of undecided voters, much more than in previous years. There were also other models that pointed towards more of a closer race, and I'll get into that. So it looks like there was also some wishful thinking going on among the experts. Experts tend to be more liberal, so they might have picked selectively information that kind of supported their own views. Another really old method that has been used in the US since the 19th century is so-called prediction markets. These are betting markets where people bet on the outcome of the election, and you can use the betting quotes as a forecast of what is going to happen. You know this from sports betting, and you know that betting quotes for sports are also pretty accurate. And this is also the case for elections, at least before this election. Again, you can see the historical error is very low. It used to be one of the most accurate methods that we have to predict election outcomes. In this election, dramatically off. And again, dramatically over-predicting Clinton's chances. To me, this really kind of shows what happened here. So we know from prior research that the people who participate in these markets, they tend to be highly educated, they tend to be wealthier, they tend to be very politically active and engaged. So it just kind of seems that the people who were participating there and betting real money on these markets, so they lose a lot of money by being wrong, they just couldn't really relate to the rest of society anymore. They couldn't really understand that so many people would end up voting for Donald Trump. The third method that we use are so-called citizen forecasts, and this is my favorite. It's also been around for a very long time, since the 1930s, and it's my favorite because it's incredibly simple. So instead of people asking, like, who are you going to vote for, ask them who is going to win the election. And if you use this information, it turns out that this is the most accurate method that we have for predicting election outcomes in the United States. It was the most accurate before this election historically, and again in this election, it's among the most accurate methods. And then, of course, the polls came much later. They came in the 1930s, the start of scientific polling. And again, we know that polls have error. But there were large polling errors, such as this one in 1948. 2016 will be among them as well, at least at the state level. But there's also been excellent work on aggregating polls and making polls more accurate by combining them. So it's again the idea of combining forecasts, combining lots of different information. And again, as you can see here, polls were actually not that bad 2016 compared to previous elections. Another group of methods that we use are so-called political economy models. These models are developed by political scientists. They have a long tradition since the 1970s. And the idea here is that voting is retrospective. So the idea is that voters look back. They look at how well the incumbent government has done its job, in particular in handling the economy. And then they use economic indicators, for example, to predict the election outcome. They also use kind of the electoral cycle. We know that Americans tend to kind of want to have the out party in power after a while, so there's a kind of a penalty if the incumbent party was in office for too long. These are kind of these variables that these models use. There's actually a professor here in Paris as well, Bruno Jerome, an economist who has been doing this type of work also for US elections since, I think the early 2000s, and his model was among the most accurate ones in the last 2 elections, actually. The interesting thing about these models is that historically they weren't that accurate, but they were really accurate in this election, and I get back to this in a second. And then there are what we call index models. Oh, I should maybe go back, because the interesting thing about these models is that they assume that the candidates and campaigns don't play any role, which is really counterintuitive, especially for that election, which was so candidate-centered with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in the race, and they performed so well. And then there are these models that were specifically designed to kind of track the role of candidates and particularly campaigns on the election outcome. So these models, for example, look at how voters perceive the candidates to handle the issues facing the country. And again, you can see that the error this time was really high compared to previous elections, again because they overestimated Clinton, because Clinton was favored on the issues, which might also say something about the media coverage in this election, which wasn't really about issues. So it could be that the model didn't work as well because the issues weren't really debated in the media coverage. So what we know from prior research, and this is nothing new from 2016, is that the accuracy of different methods varies a lot across elections. And you can see this here in this chart. The blue bars show you always the historical error from that method, ordered from least accurate to most accurate. And the red bars or orange bars show you the error in 2016. And you can see there's a negative correlation. Methods that did really well in the past did not that well this time, such as prediction markets. And methods that didn't really do well in the past did pretty good this time, such as political economy models. So the point is, it's really incredibly difficult ahead of time to say which method will turn out to be most accurate. So if you would have asked me, for example, which method do you think, prior to the election, which method do you think will be the worst? I would have probably picked political economy models for 2 reasons. First of all, they haven't been that great to begin with historically, and second of all, they assume that candidates don't play any role, which seemed really not the best condition for this election. So I would have been totally wrong. And that's why combining forecasts is so valuable, because you use more information, because you can use different methods. And usually the errors that are associated with any individual method tend to cancel out in the aggregate. The problem in this year was that most methods erred in the same direction. So most methods overpredicted Clinton by a lot, which is why combining wasn't as useful. It was still useful because, as you can see here in the chart, that's the error historically, and this is the error in this election from our approach. It kind of avoided making large errors, but it wasn't among the most accurate methods this time. But the claim is not that it's always among the most accurate methods. The claim is that when you do this, and you should really consider 2016 as kind of an outlier, the claim is that if you do this over and over and over, because the accuracy of individual methods varies over time, you really increase your chance to, over time, have the most accurate method. And I think another very important part about this is that it helps you to learn. First of all, it helps you to learn about research. For us, it's really interesting to see which methods perform well over time in different conditions. But also as a journalist, it helps you to learn about what information is out there. So think of our platform as a kind of a library of forecasts. We pretty much collect everything that is out there, and we categorize it into different systems and categories. And what you could have seen is that there was one component, the political science models, which actually pointed towards a Trump win, at least. It's kind of tricky because they pointed towards a Trump win on the popular vote, which it didn't win. But there was some information that the fundamentals, which used to predict elections historically, pointed towards a very close race or maybe a Republican win. And this is something that really didn't make it into the media coverage as much, I think. So I want to close with a kind of a famous quote, which is, well, prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. So the point is, forecasting is not an exact science. There will always be error, there will always be randomness. In this case, maybe the random component was the FBI letter about Clinton's email shortly before the election. We certainly don't know. But the point is, and I think this was also mentioned this morning, don't take the forecasts too seriously, especially also as journalists. The forecasts itself aren't the news. And kind of make sure that you really capture all the information that is out there, which was there, it just hasn't really been seen. That's what I have so far, and I'm happy to take questions.